Hello, big-time spenders. Eric from Dead Tech here, and today I am doing experiments in B-roll because I am doing my best to become a huge YouTuber, kind of like, what's the video game guy, PewDiePie? Anyway, as you can see, I'm taking this pretty seriously and taking the advice that anyone would give an aspiring whatever, and closely following all the titans of industry to learn from their... I'm sorry, I can't even say this with a straight face. All right, wrapping up that non sequitur and back to the point of what we're doing here today, it is another reader question roundup where you ask me questions and I answer them. If you would like to ask me a question, you can do so at deadtech.com/ask. Just fill out that little form, it's pretty quick, and I'll get the question. Ask me about anything you want, and I do appreciate you doing so because these are, after all, the fuel that powers this channel. So speaking of fuel in the channel and whatever else I just said, let's do some reader questions. First question of the day, if you watched the last video, which I'll put a little eye thing up here that you can click on to see the last video for this context, but you don't really need that video for context. Basically, there was a two-part question that I answered part one of in that video, and here is part two, again from TJ, and the question is, what problems can software consultants typically solve well simply by giving advice? Now, this is a pretty good question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give some examples throughout my management and strategy consulting years of the kind of problems in the industry that I gave advice about and got paid for. But let me do a little stage setting before we get to that. So when we're talking about advice, being consultative, if you will, there is this kind of four-part problem-solving process that I want to explain so that you can understand where most people in the software world have fit in and are used to fitting in, and where, if you're giving advice, you would fit in. So anyway, that's a little abstract. Let's get to the actual framework. Think of, I guess, the medical world. That's a good metaphor for this. And there are four parts to problem solving, and I'll give an example from the medical world that will kind of ground this. But you've got, in chronological order and also from most to least strategic, you've got diagnosis of a problem, prescription of a therapy, you have application of the therapy, and then any reapplication or maintenance of the therapy. So for instance, let's say that you feel a sharp pain in your knee after doing something, you go to the doctor says, looks like you have dislocated your knee. Diagnosis. Next up, the doctor says, and I'm going to give a slightly maybe complicated version of this, but the doctor says, here is your prescription. We're going to pop your knee back into place. Then we're going to put a cast on it for a few weeks where we're going to immobilize you, and then your muscles and stuff are going to atrophy during that period. So the last part of the therapy is for you to go to a gym and work with a personal trainer to kind of get your knee and your leg back in shape. So that is the prescription. What happens next is the doctor actually participates in a little bit of the application of the therapy, popping that knee back in. But then the doctor kind of hands it off and says, hey, I specialize in diagnosis and prescription, so the actual part where you wear the cast, you're going to have to perform that labor and make sure you don't rip off the cast or whatever. And then there's this physical trainer that's going to help you with the rest of the labor, getting back into shape. And then you've got like reapplication of the therapy. Maybe from now on you have to wear a brace when you're doing certain things. That's even below the pay grade of the physical therapist, much less the doctor. And that's up to you, put on that, the doctor's not going to hang around doing physical therapy with you and putting a brace on you every day. So that's kind of a good, helpful framework for thinking about problem solving in the corporate world, where those same kind of steps and ideas still apply. So maybe in the corporate world, let's do an example of, say, a hardware store that's saying, hey, our sales are really down. Why is that? And maybe it turns out a consultant comes in and says, oh, well, I've identified the problem, diagnosis. There is a big chain store that moved in across town, and they're letting people do some online ordering, and they've got lower prices. So that's the diagnosis. That's the problem. What does the consultant advise you do about it?
So we just went ahead and fixed the glitch.
Great.
Build a website to allow yourself some online ordering, talk to different wholesalers, maybe to get cheaper prices, and then launch a social media blitz about shop local. So that's your prescription of a therapy. Now, here's where the software professional might come in, is in the application of the therapy. that application probably involves a few things: somebody calling up a bunch of wholesalers, somebody building a website, and somebody becoming a social media ninja and doing social media. And that's where you might historically come in as a software laborer. Guess who's going to build the website? Hey, we've got some wireframes, we've got some stuff that you should do. It needs to allow X, Y, and Z. Go. You turn those specs into code. All right, that accomplished. Now there's probably some other firm that takes over the maintenance and so on and so forth. And that's a nice transition back into what I wanted to talk here about, which is that the reason, instead of just giving examples, I wanted to sort of preface this, is that we in the software world are so used to labor, and our labor is knowledge work, and it's complicated and it's problem solving, but it is still labor, and it still plugs you in, often context free, as to what business problem you're solving. So what happens when people ask for advice like this, the way you're thinking of the world is kind of, okay, I'm used to this labor situation, and I'm used to having opinions about the labor. So like, I can tell you that you should use Rails instead of Python, or I can tell you that, this particular design pattern works well. And that's not the kind of advice anyone cares about. Your hardware store, if you come to him talking about Rails and design patterns, he's going to have no idea what you're talking about, because that's not the actual problem being solved. There's no diagnosis or prescription really that's that far in the weeds. So backing up, what kind of problems can you solve? And why did I mention all of this? Well, I'm mentioning all of this to really get you to back away from working with people that know much of anything about what you know about. Because the way that you're going to be doing diagnosis and prescription is to butt up against people that have no idea what you're doing. Like this hardware store owner doesn't know the first thing about websites or anything like that. So you need to be talking to people compared to whom you are an undisputed expert. So think of it this way. With the hardware store owner, it doesn't matter if you're 2 weeks into a boot camp.
Today is Christmas. There will be a magic show at 0930.
Or 20 years into an app dev career. Either way, you're going to know far more about web development than the hardware store owner. So you want to be looking for situations like that. And for a lot of us, that's going to get us out of our comfort zone. But you want to go find people where you can give them software advice or advice related to things that you've done in the past that they would have no idea how to ascertain for themselves and no interest in learning about. So what are some examples based on my own travels? Here are a few. One that I've done a good bit of is the RFP process. So small firm, no in-house development expertise or anything, no real interest in having in-house development expertise, but suddenly they need to build a new system, maybe a website or some line of business thing. Anyway, they have to do a one-time thing where they're going to go out and find some firm to build them some software over the course of 3 or 6 months or something. How do you do that? They don't know. What they're going to do is they're going to go and do a proposal, and they're going to get 5 bids, and they're going to pick the second cheapest one. So I come in and I help them. I'm going to spend a couple of weeks, and I am going to give advice, and the output of that advice is going to be a selection, a recommendation of which firm to choose. Maybe I help you negotiate with them, that kind of thing. So if we think of this in terms of diagnosis and prescription, I guess here they've kind of done the diagnosis and I'm helping them with prescription. Like they've diagnosed that they need something, although I will often participate and vet that on the discovery call. Like, okay, you're saying you're going to commission this app dev, why do it? But there I'm really helping with prescription, consultative advice on which of these firms to pick, and then the firms themselves kind of take care of the labor. Another one that I've done a lot over the course of time is helping like a new CIO or somebody without a lot of line of sight into their code base make decisions about their application portfolio. So should I sunset this application? Should I pull the plug immediately, evolve it? That type of thing. And they don't have a lot of expertise to go peeking in the code themselves. And maybe they don't trust their team because there's going to be inherent bias there. That's a second example. A third I can think of is a company is looking to grow, or they've had a shakeup, or they've made an acquisition or something, and they're looking to construct an org chart for their software group. That's another thing. I've come in and helped companies build org charts. So basically, I have knowledge of things in and around the software industry that somebody lacks, and I come in and I give advice. Now, there are a few things in this type of advice and this type of engagement where you're in diagnosis and prescription that are kind of true. Number one is what I'd mentioned before, which is the person you're working with knows far less about it than you do, and they're not interested in knowing about it. But number two is these are very short strategic engagements. So you can't look at these as precursors to you giving a lot of labor to the client. And they can't be coincidental with that, meaning you can't be in there laboring and also looking for opportunities to sort of spout opinions. Neither of those work. So an important thing to mention here is you can solve all sorts of problems that are diagnosis and prescription, but you have to prepare yourself for a service delivery where you're not going to be involved very long. They're going to ask you for some very strategic expertise. You're going to give that, and then it's over. So what kind of problems, I guess, on the whole can software consultants solve? I mean, really, the sky's the limit. But basically, it's anything that involves diagnosing and prescribing something in and around software, and really anything you come up with from there. All right, that was maybe a little more time consuming. This will probably be a shorter one to answer. So question 2. Short form is working in Salesforce a good idea? I don't have a screen cap of this, but basically, so this is another one of those that's kind of a mix of stuff that I was talking with somebody about and the actual question. So he says, hey, Eric, I've been working as a Salesforce developer consultant for a couple of years on a small team. Your blog was a godsend to me, and I love reading about your concepts. Thank you. I want to know what you think about Salesforce in general. The reason I went this route is that as an opportunist, I saw that most traditional developers despise it, which added to the demand that industry has for newcomers. All right, so it goes on to talk in a little more detail about some, I guess, out of band for the question stuff that he and I were discussing. But I think the question here is a good one. He references opportunists. Again, I'll do a link down below in the description if you want to read more up on that. If you've seen these videos or followed my blog, you know what that means, but it's this kind of framework. I'm not going to go into it here, except to say that the opportunist is part of this framework that really has more to do with the internal goings on at a company. It is not really all that relevant to what you're asking here, because an opportunist and idealist, like those things, really apply to how you negotiate and work with others inside of a company. This, becoming a Salesforce developer, going to where other people aren't, so to speak, is more of a long-range career strategy that transcends any one company, and would even be a good strategy for being your own boss, like being off on your own. So do I think that this is a good idea? Yes, absolutely. I think one of the great tragedies of our industry, when it comes to software, is that everyone in the world is trying to be the best generic Java developer and compete against 5 million other developers for that title, which is ridiculous. I think a much better play is to go and do things that are more specialized and aren't as competitive, where you can help people much more readily. And becoming a Salesforce developer is a good example. I think that that's a pretty good ecosystem. I don't know a ton about it. I did have a brief stint where I worked with their Apex, probably like 8 years ago. So I don't know a lot about it. So let me caveat that by saying, as long as there's significant demand for those positions that's being underserved, it's a good idea. If that platform were to sort of atrophy, then it wouldn't be as strategic a play. But really, as long as the demand is there, I would say absolutely. As an aside, one of the things I saw in my consulting travels a lot is, what is a surprisingly great career path? Go be a COBOL developer. There are still plenty of businesses out there with the green screen mainframe type systems that just can't get off of them. And all of those developers have aged out of the workforce. So when those systems need maintenance, you know what those companies do? They go and they call people who are now in their 70s, and they just keep throwing more and more money at them until eventually they agree to come out of retirement and help.
I feel tremendous. I'm ready to take on the world. Ow!
So if you want, $200 to $300 an hour work, go learn you some COBOL. I'm dead serious. So is Salesforce a good idea? Yeah, as long as that platform sticks around. And if it maybe were to atrophy, dry up, what have you, if you could pivot into like other CRM platforms, good idea. So yes, absolutely specialize your career this way. It will ensure that you're in relative demand. You probably won't have to go through a lot of, Google style algorithm trivia hazing interviews and whatnot, the way you do when you're trying to compete with everyone in the world. So yeah, I would say go for it. Okay, so the third question here is a tweet. It comes from Jose, and let's see. I'm not looking at the actual tweet, but I have it up on my Trello board that I'm reading from. What resources, books, online courses, etc., would you recommend to software developers willing to learn more about business? Current path, the why is he is convinced, done with labor work. The question is, how do you get into business stuff? Intro to Business 101. And this was a tweet addressed to Jonathan Stark and to me. Link to Jonathan Stark's channel down in the description. This is kind of a hard one for me to answer because I think, so to get philosophical here for a moment, in software, the way that we sort of slice and dice the skills involved in being a software developer is interesting. It's almost like a tagging system, and you could capture it in like a relational database or document store or something. And what I mean by this is if you want to, let's say, be a web developer in the .NET stack, then you can go out and do a Pluralsight course about C#, about design patterns, about ASP MVC, about Razor, and on and on and on. And then your role as a C# ASP MVC web developer is just the sum of those parts. So you do all these discrete pieces of learning, you slam them all together, and suddenly you're a C# developer. And so I think that when developers want to pivot into more consultative roles or to leadership or entrepreneurship, there's this tendency to be like, all right, what 6 videos and 3 books can I consume? And then I will be an expert in business.
Sounds like a get-rich-quick scheme.
Yes, thank you. You will get rich quick. We all will.
Didn't you lose a lot of money on that other investment, the one from the email?
You know what, Toby? When the son of the deposed king of Nigeria emails you directly asking for help, you help.
And it just really doesn't work that way. So it's kind of hard for me to answer this question directly because, so here's the thing. You could learn about bookkeeping. You could learn about, I guess, entrepreneurship 101. You could learn about how to send invoices. You could learn about all those things, which would allow you to execute the mechanics of a business, but you wouldn't really be an entrepreneur, and you probably wouldn't enjoy a lot of success. Because what business is really about is identifying soft spots in the market, niches, I don't know, pronounce that how you will. You identify these soft spots in the market and then you fill them. And what's more is you have to recognize not only is there a soft spot in the market, that there's a segment being underserved, but it needs to be filled, and I could do so in a way that would be profitable enough to either earn a living or build a business. And you can read all you want about that, but it's really hard to approximate just going and figuring that out, listening to people having conversations, trial and error, etc. So I will answer the question. I'll give some recommendations here, but I wanted to caveat it by saying it's not the same as the way I could tell you a bunch of things to read if you wanted to be a C# developer. This is different, and so I'm going to give you advice that reflects that difference. Okay, so I'll do a couple of books here and I'll explain those. First is The Lean Startup. And what the Lean Startup is about, it's kind of, I think probably, if you take that concept, minimum viable product, MVP, it is one of the things that the world gets most frequently wrong, because minimum viable product is something you can assume you know what it means without reading the book. And Scrum Masters and business people and project managers everywhere do that. Go read the book. Minimum viable product doesn't mean what you think it means if you haven't read the book. What it does mean is, well, I won't give you any spoilers exactly, but it is a book that's about applying the scientific method to business, which I think makes it uniquely well suited for people in software to sort of begin the transition into business. And the minimum viable product is one specific instance of the class of the scientific method applied to business. So go read that. It'll have a lot of valuable information and get you started thinking about the kind of learning and identifying market segments that you need to do. Second book recommendation, $1 Million Consulting. It is, even if you're not thinking of going into consulting, there's just a ton of wisdom in there as to like what is valuable in business, how to become an expert, how to give advice, and just generally how to conduct yourself. So those two are my big recommendations for this transition. The other thing I'll recommend is find and identify blogs, podcasts, that type of thing that you can consume on a regular basis. So just off the top, some folks to follow. I mean, you're, I guess, following me and Jonathan, so we'll both talk about these things. But Amy Hoy with what she does, which is kind of about her 300 by 50. It's all about kind of like carving out niches and making like little products that could be lifestyle businesses. She is a great source to follow. A couple of podcasts I listen to, the Tropical MBA. It is for location independent entrepreneurs, but there's a lot of good general entrepreneurial wisdom in there. There's the Side Hustle podcast. Those are good examples of things. And so with Amy Hoy, with the podcasts, what you're doing there, if you're following these people, I would recommend immersing yourself in how these folks think and just kind of the week over week goings on of this, because that's how you're going to start to grok. It's not going to be some stuff that you consume and after binge reading it, you're good. Listening to people talk about running their businesses week over week, you'll get a feel for the sort of issues that they grapple with, how they handle them, what the thinking is like. So those are my recommendations. I'll put links to all of that down below in the description. All right, last question I do have a screen grab for. So question 4 basically is, where do I fit career-wise? And I'm going to read this. I'm curious about your thoughts on where I fit in career-wise. If I were to take a role different from the one that I have currently, I have a hodgepodge of skills. I am practiced in developing out requirements and schedules as a project manager is, and I have a lot of experience in creating designs as an architect has. On the products for which I design, clients commonly ask me to articulate recommendations with reasons for that advice as a consultant does. The implementations of those suggestions are well coded and verified, at least in part, by me as well. I tend to code the core parts before handing them off to other developers to extend. As the developers check extensions in, I verify them through testing and reviews before handing product over for official quality assurance. Consequently, the title of architect/senior developer most closely fits what I do. Yet a traditional architect or senior developer position would not utilize a sizable part of my skill set. For example, I'm not gathering requirements, developing schedules or scopes, or making recommendations as a typical architect or senior developer. My question is, what roles are a good fit for me given this medley of skills? All right, so that's an easy one to answer. The answer is none in the traditional corporate environment. I'm not being flippant. The reason that the answer is none is because what you're doing, as you say, is a hodgepodge of things, activities, responsibilities that typically fit into a few different roles. Software developer, architect, project manager, business analyst. So in the traditional corporate world, there usually isn't a person who does all of those things, because the traditional corporate world, when it comes to software, heavily segments and silos that. You've got, software developer, software tester, operations, you've got business analyst, scrum master, assuming it's a scrum shop, project manager, product manager, etc. So all of this specialization that the corporate world has decided is largely necessary in order to construct software. So as an organization gets bigger, you get more and more fragmentation and siloing. In recent years, you've had this Agile and DevOps movement that kind of says, hey, let's get a little more cross-functional. Let's bring all those roles closer together, and maybe let's blur the lines a little bit. So that bodes well for you. But the biggest distinction I think that remains is the tech and the business. And that is a tough nut to crack, simply because if you did blur those roles, then you would have all these people without software chops that were kind of left high and dry saying, where do I fit into all this? Now, setting aside any cynicism or who should know what, should everybody know how to program, the reality is that you've got a lot of people that don't know how to program or test that are nevertheless integral in the system at the moment. And if you started to have this kind of jack of all trade roles,
this is the music you tighten up with.
You would have a lot of friction with people who would view an existential threat to the necessity of what they're doing. So combine that with just the practical elements of, as a company or software group gets big enough, you're probably not going to have one person doing all these things. And there's not a great fit for you in most organizations of any decent size. So if you want to roll in a corporation that scratches all these itches that you have, where, you know, if your requirement is that you want to do all of these things in the role and you don't want any turf wars over it, the real role that you're going to have to look for is maybe a shop that has one or two kind of ad hoc IT or software people working there and is growing enough that maybe they need someone senior to come in and kind of manage them. So look for a small non-software shop with a couple of people that is looking for somebody to herd the cats. And if you brought in as kind of the dev manager, if you will, where you've got 1, 2, 3 people reporting to you, that's not a big enough shop where you're going to stop doing anything technical. So you're going to be a part-time manager. You're kind of going to be the de facto project manager, business analyst person. And then you're going to have a couple of people reporting to you who do software, but you're going to do a little of it yourself and probably the architecture. That is a dynamic I've seen in a lot of small companies that I've consulted with, kind of when I'm doing the aforementioned, we're not really a big company, we need help with an RFP process and org chart. I see that a lot in companies that want my expertise as kind of a rent a CIO for a week or something. So it exists, but it's not overly common, and it's going to really limit you in terms of organizational growth. It's a good role if you can get it, especially given what you're expressing wanting to do. But as that company gets bigger and there's more hires, it will expand past where you can keep doing that role. So it's kind of ephemeral. Now, let me close here by saying, if you really want to do that, in my world where I'm defining, you know, neologisms because it's fun, that's called an efficiencer. So an efficiencer is somebody who comes in and does diagnosis and prescription and then oversees or executes at their discretion the labor. An efficiencer is kind of a doctor of software, if you will.
Good morning. Now, full disclosure, most of my experience is putting babies in women.
Oh, I'm gonna kill that man.
You just described my morning.
Because like a doctor, the doctor will do diagnosis and prescription, and then it's up to the doctor how much of the application of the therapy they want to be involved in. But they own that process soup to nuts. And that's what the efficiencer does. And that's kind of what you're describing is you want to come in, you know, gather up requirements, furnish expertise, and then maybe do the labor or maybe delegate it. So you can find a role at a company, but you might be better served hanging out your shingle and setting up your own practice if you truly want to do all of that stuff. Thank you for watching that reader question roundup. I do appreciate you tuning into these videos. If you would like to ask a reader question, you can do so at deadtech.com/ask. I will also have a link to that down in the description so you can go there right from this page. If you like this video, it'd be great if you could give me a like. It's not just fluff, it actually does help the channel. And if you liked it enough that you want to subscribe, I encourage you to do so. If you're going to do that, maybe click the bell down below because that will give you an email each time a new video is posted to the channel. And I'll say what I have always said, which is that if you don't like, feel free to give it a thumbs down. I am looking for feedback in whatever form it comes, whether it's comments, likes, dislikes, however you want to engage is of course your business. So with that, I will say thanks again for watching and I will catch you next time.